Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I guess by now, good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the House. Have the privilege of bringing you Senate Joint Resolution number 14. It comes to us from Senators Holdman, Michael Young, Pete Miller, Ratz, Jay Smith, Bassler, Steele, and Patricia Miller. The House co-sponsors are Representatives Schmaltz, Morrison, and Lehman. And I also want to acknowledge and thank the hard work of the grassroots activists around the state, many of whom are joining us here tonight. And I hope you have had the opportunity over the past several weeks to interface with them and learn more about Senate Joint Resolution number 14. Article 5 of the Constitution states as follows: the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to the Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. First, a word about the process. 2/3 of the states, 34 in number, must make application to Congress for a convention to propose amendments to the Constitution. Then, 3/4 of the states, 38 in number, are required to ratify proposed amendments to the Constitution. Now, many of you might recall, in 2014, Indiana established our faithful delegate law, setting rules for delegates to a convention. And that law is now a model for other states. Congress's only role is to set a time and a place for the meeting of the states. The language before you in SJR 14 has been introduced in 38 states in their current sessions and has been adopted to date in Florida, Georgia, Alaska, Tennessee, and Alabama. The rationale behind this is Congress will not take action to restrain itself. And James Madison's fear gives reason for having an Article 5 provision for states' actions. Now, before you in SJR 14 are 3 substantive provisions. The first is to impose fiscal restraint on the federal government. The second is to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. And the third is to impose term limits on federal officials. Now, should time go on and we have second thoughts, we can always withdraw this resolution if at a later date a later legislature determines it's no longer appropriate. And keep in mind, Indiana's pioneering faithful delegate law will make sure that those delegates we send carry out our intention. With that, we had some very interesting and stimulating discussion in the Judiciary Committee with some real experts, and I want to thank Chairman Sturwald and the other members of the committee for their good work on this resolution, and would urge your support. Thank you.
Further discussion on the resolution. Representative Nicely.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, for many years I've been a proponent of using the Article 5 convention process to repeal the 17th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The 17th Amendment gave us the direct election of senators, which basically gave us 2 houses of representatives in Washington and no Senate representing the states. I've come to the conclusion that even if we got 34 states to request a convention for the purpose of repealing the 17th Amendment, the convention could not and would not be limited to that one single purpose. We have a resolution in front of us today that attempts to limit the convention to 3 issues. I have to come to the same conclusion. The convention cannot and will not be limited to those 3 issues. There's a possibility that good amendments would be proposed in this convention. There's also a likelihood that what I would call bad amendments would be proposed in this convention. I'm very concerned that there will be a crisis, either real or manufactured, during the convention or during the ratification process. If the Congress chooses to hold ratification conventions in the states, we, the legislature, may not have an opportunity to reject these bad amendments. I've had discussions with several of you today and realized that you have not had time to think through many of the concerns of this resolution. As the sponsor pointed out, there's only 5 states that have already adopted this, so there's many more to go. I think that we'll have time in future years to adopt this resolution if we don't adopt it today. So I'm going to urge you to vote no on this resolution today, and then use the next few months to get answers to those concerns.
Further discussion? Representative Pelath?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the House. This is not the worst piece of legislation this session, but it is the goofiest. This process for amending the U.S. Constitution has not been used in over 2 centuries for a very good reason. It's extraordinarily unwieldy, and it does not, one that inherently possesses the refinement that's necessary for getting the appropriate words into the U.S. Constitution. We actually have here from Indiana one of the great lawmakers of all time, a guy by the name of Birch Bayh, U.S. Senator, who wrote more of the U.S. Constitution than anybody except James Madison. He actually authored 2 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and it would have been a third had the Equal Rights Amendment been ratified. But it was understood that you had to be extraordinarily careful anytime you amended the Constitution because the implications were so far-reaching. And as we've seen, many times throughout history, often impossible to predict. And that requires the legislative process that exists in Congress. Now, we can complain about Congress being dysfunctional, and in many ways it is, but we also have the world's oldest and greatest living body of laws oversees our country. You know what? Our country, more often than not, is in pretty good shape. We get up every morning, people live in relative safety, they get to voice their views without being thrown in jail for them, and people are able to get in a car and drive to work. And they usually have the lights turn on when they wake up in the morning. Let's not pretend like we have so many problems in our society that we need to resort to things like this. Representative Nisley actually makes an extraordinary point, and he makes the one that I was going to make. You cannot convene these people and limit them. You cannot convene a constitutional convention and at that moment tell them that they're only able to discuss the narrow things that you have selected for them. I'm going to give you a few examples of realistic things that they could discuss that you probably wouldn't like. The Second Amendment could be revised. It could be made clear, perhaps, by some that there's no individual right to self-protection. Okay, that's something that folks might choose to worry about. Campaign finance reform. We tried to clarify that a little bit, that maybe that's something that they ought to discuss. But end of corporate personhood and limitation on speech through dollars could be discussed at a constitutional convention. Here's another one that I suspect might scare some people of the Republican ilk. It could clarify that in the words themselves, that the right to privacy exists. Okay, that's one that's been implied. It's been sustained in Supreme Court decisions like Roe v. Wade, but perhaps there would be an effort to make that clear for all time. Now, these are all things that cause a great degree of controversy, both in this chamber and our society. But imagine if you had a constitutional convention discussing all these things. Right now, more often than not, through our legislative branch, our executive branch, and our judicial branch, we've more or less on most days sort of found a balance. We're not happy about everything in our society. We don't always agree about the direction and the vision, but more often than not, we're able to continue to have the same arguments that don't become destabilizing. And that's what I worry could happen with this methodology. Our founders put it there because they weren't sure exactly how the republic would grow and how it would prosper. They couldn't foresee what society would be like today. So they put this in here. But as society has grown, it's become very clear that we should only amend the Constitution with very great hesitation, and it should be done within the confines of our elected lawmakers and their elected legislatures at the state level. And it's worked, and we are able to make prudent changes in our nation's history when it makes sense. But this is going to take us in a very troubling direction, and I would urge its defeat. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For the discussion, Representative Judy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the House. I've had, over the summer, had the chance to meet with a lot of COS people and talk about this issue, and I actually rise in opposition to this resolution. When we look at this resolution, we already have fiscal restraint on the federal government. Federal spending is limited to the enumerated powers delegated to the federal government within our U.S. Constitution. They're located in Article 1, Section 2, 5, 6, 8, 9, and Article 2, Section 1 and 3. The Constitution delegates to Congress only limited and narrowly defined authority to spend money. A balanced budget amendment would lawfully substitute a budget for the enumerated powers. This would legalize the current practice where Washington spends money on whatever they put in the budget. This would lawfully increase the powers of the federal government. This would authorize the federal government to exercise power over any object they decide to put in the budget. The second thing I look at in this resolution is term limits. As for term limits for our U.S. representatives and senators, we already do. We can vote them out. Unlimited term limits are not the problem. The real cause is electing people to Washington that disregard the Constitution. We should be focusing on repealing the 17th Amendment. As originally written in our U.S. Constitution, senators were chosen by the state legislatures. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 1. James Madison stated in Federalist Number 62 that the appointment of senators by the state legislature was to secure the authority of the state governments and the federal government. He said, and I quote, "The equal vote allowed to each state is at once a constitutional recognition of the portion of sovereignty remaining in the individual states and an instrument for preserving the residuary sovereignty in order to guard against an improper consolidation of the states into one simple republic." He also stated in Federalist 45 that the Senate will be elected absolutely and exclusively by the state legislatures. Thus, each of the principal branches of the federal government, federal government will owe its existence more or less to the favor of the state governments. The 17th Amendment was enacted in 1913, and since then we have lost federalism. We have to go back and elect our U.S. senators if we truly want states' rights. Thank you.
Representative Wright for further discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I represent a very conservative district, and gun ownership is very, very important. And a lot of those people have reached out to me and said that they just want me to pause and think about, before voting on this, the further ramifications of putting such thing into action. So with that in mind, I don't feel comfortable giving a yes vote on this. I will vote no because of my district. Thank you.
Further discussion, Representative Lehman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this bill. I will take a little exception to the term, this is the goofiest amendment bill we've dealt with, because I take this very serious, and here's why. I think the Fifth Amendment is there for a purpose. I don't think the founders thought, well, let's throw it in there and see what might happen, and 200 years from now, it'll probably be okay. We'll just put all of our faith in the elected officials in Washington. So when I look at this and I see, well, we don't want to use it because we've never used it before. We need to trust, and I think, I'm not paraphrasing your Representative Pilaf, but you said, these are elected officials in Washington. We need to trust them. They'll do it. Their approval rating is in almost single digits. I think the American people were saying they're not doing what we've sent them to do. I agree with you, Representative Judy. I'm not a big fan of term limits. What I'm a fan of is I'm a fan of the fact that when we say we have a tool that we can use to go to the public and say we have a better way to govern our finances, it's through an amendment process, and we say, well, we don't want to do that. $19 trillion in debt. People, $19 trillion, that is $58,000 per citizen. And we stand here and talk about, well, what if they want to talk about the Second Amendment? Well, what if they want to talk about the Fifth Amendment or the Seventh Amendment or the 10th Amendment? How about this? We're $19 trillion in debt. You know, we're worried about things that, yes, we should be concerned about, but understand our country is heading down a very dangerous path. And we must utilize a tool that we have at our disposal to say enough spending is enough. And it's time to talk about a balanced budget, and this does it. And the founder's intent, you can go back and read the Federalist Papers, read the Anti-Federalist Papers. There's a lot of things the founders never thought we'd ever get to. But I honestly believe if James Madison is here today, his argument would be, you have the tool and use it. And to your point, Representative Judy, the 17th Amendment, that wasn't proposed by the states. That was proposed by the people we're saying we trust to pass positive amendments. It is time to use this Fifth Amendment. I think ask for your support.
Representative Pierce for further discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House. This is actually a pretty dangerous thing we're toying with here, in my opinion. Now, first of all, it's like this is not the right list. I mean, this list might appeal to the majority of people in here, but where's the list that deals with the runaway corporate power and the corruption of our political system with endless dark money flooding into our federal elections and now working their way in their state elections? You don't even know where the money's coming from. We had an opportunity to add that to the list. We chose not to. So we're ignoring really what goes to the heart of, I think, are the constituents' concerns about the federal government. It's not responsive to us. Why is it? Because the electoral process has been corrupted. And the Supreme Court rulings have really limited the ability to do anything about campaign finance reform today. We should have been doing something about that, but we didn't. Now, the issues on this list, I mean, they're really appealing. They have some good political kind of power to them, but, term limits, that's so 1990s. I mean, it's like retro. Now, here's the dangerous part. Here's the dangerous part. We've heard about Georgia and Alabama, I think, and some other states kind of getting on the bandwagon, and they've really locked down their delegations. Yeah, I think we even said we'd send ours to jail if they did anything we didn't want. But what do you think is going to happen when we have this convention and a delegation from New York shows up in town, and the delegation from California, and the delegation from Illinois, and the delegation from Massachusetts, and the delegation from Vermont, and the delegation from Oregon, to name a few? What do you think they'll be sent to prison for if they vote on? They're going to have a whole different agenda. And the legal scholars are arguing about whether or not you can really lock down this convention to just these three topics. I think it's way out in the open. And I think if we were going to go down this path and risk this, we should be really addressing the true corruption of our system, not these, politically appealing kind of bumper sticker things we put in here. Because once you open this thing up, who knows what's going to happen? And the previous speaker is exactly right. You have some kind of crisis, terrorist attack or something, and out might go our privacy right out the door because people are afraid and they want something done. I mean, look what's happening in France. They had that terrorist attack, those shootings, and they suspended their constitution, and now they want greater police powers, and that's very appealing to people when they're fearful. So, to vote for this, maybe it's to send a nice political message and have a talking point for the next election cycle, I don't think is a very good way to go. It's too dangerous. We ought not do it. I urge you to vote no.
Representative Smaltz for further discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, ladies and members of the House. I'm going to jump back into my Mrs. Eisenhut's class, my 11th grade civics. And if she's still out there, I just want her to know I didn't turn out as bad as she repeatedly predicted. I remember what she said. We talked about this. So we're just going to talk about the facts, not really what we're all talking about, the 17th Amendment or the balanced budget. This is how a constitutional convention works. First of all, it's in there for a reason. George Mason put it in there. He was the one who put it in there. It wasn't John Adams. It wasn't Madison. It wasn't anybody else. It was George Mason. And that was a deal breaker. That had to go in. People weren't going to sign on. We do it here all the time. And they had conventions in those days. It was not an unusual thing. It's a tool the federal government has given us. And this wild notion of this runaway convention, Congress can set amendments today. They're like a 12-year-old with the keys to the car. And they still haven't got it done. There's been all R's where they've got the Senate and the House and the executive branch. It's been the D's have had it. We've had 10,000 attempts to amend the Constitution. My personal favorite is changing our name to the United States of Earth. Now, that's not going to pass. You have to have 34 states to call a convention. You have to have 38 states to ratify what you've decided in the convention. That's just as simple as that gets. And personally, I think that we're already there on the number, but Congress has to call the convention. That's the rule. And if you look, 42 states have asked for it. Indiana asked for it in March of 1861. There's no rescinding that. Once you've asked for it, you've asked for it. But since they're different, since they might be just a little different, and the words are a little different, no good. Not going to do it. Can't do it. So this is an effort to have similar language and put it to Congress and say, okay, they're fine. 34 states have all asked in the exact same manner. Now what? Now what's the reason to not have it? Our federal government's out of control. This was here for a reason. It wasn't here because somebody just wanted to stick it in there for, get in the newspaper. There was concern going forward. How would the federal government behave? And you can restrict your delegates. Delaware did it. 1787, Delaware delegates were not allowed to agree to any sort of proportional representation, period. That's where our Senate came from. But not for them. It would be representation only, proportional. And Indiana would have a much smaller voice than we do today. So of course you can tell your delegates what to do. This is the right thing to do. We need to stand up for Indiana. We need to stand up for the states. We have rights. We need to exercise them. We're stronger than we think. I urge you to support this.
Representative Delaney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very serious matter, and we're being asked to take a very serious step that I think we should not take for two reasons. First of all, let's ask ourselves whether the United States of America need this right now. Since this was put in the Constitution and not used, we had a civil war. We didn't need to call one of these conventions. We had 2 world wars. We had the Great Depression. We had the Great Recession. The predicate for this whole effort is false. The predicate is that this country's gone to hell in a handbasket. I reject the premise, and you ought to reject the premise. But let's go on. Starting with the false premise that America is just finished, no longer great, needs a salesman to make us great again. Start with that premise, and then it leads to the notion that, well, it should be fixed. Well, we fixed it, my friends, in 2010. Changed the Congress. Fixed it in 2012. Made it worse than in 2010. Fixed it again in 2014. In my view, we made it worse again. This is an effort to cover the fact that the Congress has been changed on a false premise. A, that America was going to hell, and B, that electing these individuals would fix it. Now the new false premise is we have a convention and we'll figure out how to do it all in this unending convention. We'll get it all straightened out. We'll protect the Second Amendment if that's what you think, or we'll attack the Second Amendment if that's what you think. We'll define privacy in a very liberal way or a very conservative way. This vote could be very different, my friends, depending on the election in November. You know, it's suggested by some that we can't appoint Supreme Court justices because, you know, we got a presidential election. Well, I assure you that some of you may be running, you know, for cover if you pass this and you know who was elected president. Okay? You're acting for the moment. You're not acting for the long haul. This is a long haul country. This is the #1 democracy, the longest lasting democracy, and the most prosperous country on earth. And the main reason it is because we passed a really good Constitution and we left it alone. And if we screw it up and say that slaves are not humans and can be caught as fugitives and sent back, we'll do something about it. We'll have a war, and then we'll pass amendments to the Constitution in a normal way. We know how to deal with our problems, and the way to deal with it is by not putting together some kind of a dreamt-up organization. So I suggest you just leave this alone, and if you're tempted to touch this third rail, ask yourself how you're going to feel if things don't go the way you'd like this November. That ought to stop you. Thank you.
Representative Ellington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members of the House. I just made a couple of notes back here. Basically, it's a tool. Will it be processed? Will it be fulfilled? We don't know. But what we do know is government is out of control. It's out of control for spending. It's out of control for regulations. When individuals are forced to buy a product, that, to me, is out of control. When a homeowner or a farmer in my community cannot give an acre of ground to his family member to continue the operation of a farm, that is out of control. There's many issues. This is a tool. Let's use it. Thank you.
Further discussion? Representative Borders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I owe some folks an apology out there. That folks that had asked me about this issue, I had told them that they were lobbying for it. I told them I was going to support it, and I've changed my mind. And the reason I have, just to be really frank with it, is I've heard some of the other speakers and some that I've spoken with or heard earlier. I think they bring out a very valid point. You know, it's one of the things I remember as serving as mayor of my home city of Jasonville. Frequently, there would be ordinances that we had that we wouldn't enforce those ordinances, and so we would come up with a new one rather than enforcing the existing ones that we had. And I feel like that's kind of what we're doing here. You know, if you look, and I'd be glad to challenge anyone on this, actually the 16th Amendment, the one that created the income tax in 1913, I believe, was truly never ratified in a legal fashion. It never was. In fact, any time people have offered to debate a congressman, a senator, regardless of who it is, they simply won't do it. And the problem of it is the spending is not a problem of our Constitution at present. It's because we don't obey it. You know, the initial Constitution only allowed for consumption taxes, and we've gone well beyond that. You know, one of my great heroes of the free market system, Milton Friedman, he actually created withholding from income taxes. He did it during wartime, and he said that was one of his quotes was that was nearly maybe his greatest regret that he had ever done. He never dreamed that the U.S. government would continue down that path and basically spend our children, our grandchildren, and great-grandchildren into oblivion. So again, with all due respect to those people that I told I would support this, I simply in good conscience cannot do it, and I rise in opposition. I think our Constitution as it is fine. I think it's just high time that we started obeying it. Thank you.
Representative Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the chamber. Representative Smaltz, Representative Delaney, Representative Borders, all got up here and gave very good, eloquent reasons for and against. I'm just going to come right out and say I don't trust the federal government, and it's that simple. To me, they're not following the Constitution right now. We are one Supreme Court justice away from having our Second Amendment rights taken away from us. That's pretty scary. And to me, that's a big thing. And that's a big thing to a lot of Hoosiers, a big thing to a lot of Americans, because the numbers prove that. Okay, if we pass this, who's to say if they're ignoring parts of the Constitution right now, how can we be assured they're going to be paying attention to whatever we hope to tell them to do? And as far as a balanced budget, $19 trillion in debt. Do the math. I talked to a high school class one time. Nobody can comprehend how much a trillion is. If dollars were seconds, a million seconds is 11 and a half days. A billion seconds is 32 years. A trillion seconds is 32,000 years. Now that'll help put some of that in perspective. Now we're 19 trillion in debt. Okay, I just saw a report today. A third of America's assets is in the form of college loans. College debt. Now this is the generation, our best and brightest that we convinced they have to go to school to get an education. Okay, the state of Indiana, half the kids that apply to go to college, only half will get their degree after 6 years. Okay, the half that do get their degree nationwide, they're either unemployed or underemployed. So you have a generation out there that's $1.3 trillion in debt, and America is considering that an asset. Now guess who the entity is that controls government student loans? Our government. So we're on a vicious cycle here. And if we think we can stop that by a constitutional amendment, I think we're just fooling ourselves. And the risk of doing more harm than good far outweighs any slight chance that we can get that all of a sudden we're going to convince the federal government, hey, let's start paying attention to this little piece of paper here. So until we can either get our own house in order and start doing at the grassroots level to convince people to start electing people that have some resemblance of fiscal sanity, I don't see this as being worth the effort. So I'm going to vote no.
Further discussion? Representative Bauer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the House. I'm really amazed and even shocked at the condemnation of the majority party of their majority in the House and Senate. It just amazes me because speaker after speaker from the majority party here have come up and condemned the federal government. Until maybe a week or so ago, 2/3 of that federal government was Republican. And both chambers of Congress are Republican. I have to just wonder if you've been paying attention to the elections in the last several years. You've won the majority in both houses of Congress. I meant you dominate the legislature. In fact, you dominate most of the legislatures in this country. So things are going your way, and you're condemning the government that you basically control. I'd like to rise up your spirit somehow and give you more encouragement. I want to say another thing. I've heard condemnation from many Republicans about the Chief Justice we've had for several years. He's an Indiana product. He went up to high school, I believe, right up the road from South Bend. Did he really? High school and grade school, my Lord. He's an Indiana product. Have a little more faith in your country. Yes, I'll give you one thing. We've got to do something about the deficit. And we ought to do it beginning by electing people that say they'll do something about the deficit and meet it to the federal Congress. I think this is really a pretty bad mistake you're making. And you're showing no faith in these United States of United States of America by voting for this.
Representative Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the Assembly, this past November 11th, 12th, and 13th, I went out to Salt Lake City, and I represented Indiana along with Senator Bassler and Senator Long at the Assembly for State Legislatures, which is working on the policies and procedures and rules if the convention is called. It is a bipartisan effort. So I guess I take offense when I hear that this is a Republican idea, a Republican-pushed process. When we sat out there in the Salt Lake City, or in the Utah State Capitol, which is a beautiful building, by the way, if you ever have a chance, I highly recommend going. It was Republicans and Democrats alike. Illinois was there, all Democrats. Massachusetts was there, all Democrats. Missouri was there with a handful of Democrats. Ohio, it was a Republican and Democrat event. So please don't try to paint this as a red state, blue state process. They were all there. They were represented. We had a quorum the entire time of red states, blue states, Republicans and Democrats alike. So I just want to paint that picture for you so you don't have the idea that it is what it's trying to be depicted as. Thank you.
Has anyone not spoken that desires to speak? Author has the right to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, colleagues, for this discussion. This is exactly the kind of things that makes our state legislatures great. And one of the things that I hope is going through your mind right now as you consider your vote is, who do you trust more, the federal government of today or ourselves? And I can tell you who our founders trusted more 200 plus years ago, and that was us. And they were thinking about us before any of us were obviously even born, because they gave us Article 5. Article 5 is that red emergency button encased in glass with a tool there to break the glass if necessary. So if you think things right now in Washington are going well, then you'll probably want to vote against this resolution. If you think they'll get better with time, then you might consider voting against this resolution. But if not, and you take your role here very seriously, as our founders knew that we would, your vote should be yes. Now, a couple of points I do want to touch on, because many members didn't have the benefit of hearing the testimony in the Judiciary Committee. First of all, the subject matter, that this could do away with the Second Amendment or things, these red herrings like that. It's firmly established by law in the courts that any Article 5 convention must be limited to the subject matter of the application, and that was why it's worded the way it is. And if you recall on second reading, my friend Representative Pierce brought an amendment. He is concerned about campaign finance, and I respect him for that. There is actually a group whose focus is campaign finance through Article 5. It's called Wolfpack. They're out there advocating for that. Other colleagues very concerned about the 17th Amendment, and I do believe there's groups advocating that. That's a significance of the specificity of the subject matter. So here, this convention will not get into the Second Amendment or these other things. It will be strictly limited to the subject matter of the call. Secondly, I'd remind you of the ratification requirement. That's 3/4 of our states must ratify any outcome. That's a very high threshold. It should be high, and it's not going to happen easily. So as you consider your vote, think about the founders, George Mason in particular, thinking ahead to us, wondering if what they created was the right thing to do. And just in case it wasn't or needed tweak, they gave us that emergency button in the glass box, and tonight's the night we push it. Thank you.
Questions on the adoption of Senate Joint Resolution 14 on final passage? When the machine is open, all in favor vote aye. Those opposed vote no. Representative Epperhart, Dermody, Linus. Representative Dermody. If all members voted, tally of the roll. Roll call shows 61 ayes, 36 noes. The resolution is passed.